Excellent. Love the little voice. All right. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming to the Colegio de Iberia 2. My name is Magistra Beatriz Aluares de la Hoya, and I'm from the Kingdom of Atlantia, the Barony of Highland Ford. And my area of particular interest is women and gender studies in Spain. Today's presentation will be about widowhood law in 13th century Castile. And I'm going to be covering a large amount of information in a pretty quick amount of time. So we will I'll most likely get to the questions all at the end. As you see, Marion's put up a link to both the PDF handout and a PDF copy of this slide deck. And towards the end, I will give you my contact information. You're welcome to contact me if you want to chat some more about this topic. I'm also going to apologize because I'm reading the text off of a computer that is this way. So I apologize for being rude and looking away occasionally. All right, so our first order of business is just a little bit of Spanish legal history. The legal codes in Spain date back to somewhere between 1642 and 1643 CE with the Visigothic code, which is also known as the Libri Ludiciorum or the Libro de las Huecas, which were created and promulgated by King Chindasuit. Now, those Visigothic codes expanded over time, and in the late 17th century, really transitioned from Roman law to Germanic law as more Germanic tribes moved into the Iberian Peninsula. In 1238, which is a significant date in Spanish legal history, the Fuero General de Navarra, the General Charter of Navarre, was first codified. And these fuero generals or fuero reals were sets of legal codes that were promoted within a kingdom or by a particular set of monarchs or in a particular town that laid out how formal law would work within that jurisdiction. In 1241, the Fuero Juzgo was enacted in Castile by Ferdinand III. That was basically just a translation of the Liber Judiciorum. We have a couple more dates, the Charter of Valencia that was codified under James the Conqueror. And today we'll mostly be focusing on the Siete Partidas, the 7-part code, which was compiled possibly under Alfonso X of Castile. Some accounts say that he wrote it himself. It is probably more likely that he commissioned it to be written by a committee of people. And then in 1255, Alfonso X compiled the Fuero Real, which was a royal charter. So those are the two particular legal codes that we'll be looking at in the context of widowhood law. So the Siete Partidas established a uniform body of rules for the kingdom. And most experts think that they may have been intended as a uniform legal code for the Holy Roman Empire, because Alfonso X had designs on the position of emperor. So he may have been basically enacting a practice run for a legal code for the entire Holy Roman Empire. One of the other possible reasons for its creation was to establish Castilian Spanish as a national language. The Siete Partidas is in 7 sections, which are comprised of 182 articles and 2,802 laws. And one of the really fun bits of trivia about it is that the first line of each section begins with a letter that, when combined, spell out Alfonso's name. So this was a direct tribute to him. Now, you can get copies of translations of the Siete Partidas. They're usually 10 or 15 volumes worth. The next section that we'll look at is the Fuero Real, which was a set of laws granted to all new Christian settlements in Castile. And basically, they combined, the existing legal codes with local and traditional customs to create an overarching code because they found it much easier to promote sets of laws if it incorporated things that people in the area were already doing. And the Fuero Real comes in 4 sections that cover religious life, the political authority and role of the nobility, commerce and trade, and then criminal and military procedures. And it's interesting to note that the marriage law falls into volume 3, which is under commerce and trade. So very much considered to be a business affair. Now, if you were a woman living in Spain and your husband died, you really had 3 choices of what was going to happen to you for the rest of your life. You could either enter a convent, you could enter a state that they referred to as keeping widowhood, or you could get remarried. Now, the Spanish concept of what a widow was at the time is really heavily based on the religious writings of Isidore of Seville, who lived from 560 to 663, or 636, excuse me. He was a Sevillian archbishop that was responsible for the mass conversion of the Visigoths in Spain. And his writings laid out the groundworks for a huge amount of medieval Christianity, not just on the Iberian Peninsula, but spreading out into the rest of Europe. And Isidore spends a lot of time talking about women. He spends a lot of time talking about widows. He defined a widow as a formerly married woman who neither remarried nor consorted with men. He called them excessively lazy, garrulous, interfering busybodies, and he blamed the unbridled concupiscence of widows, so the promiscuity of widows, as the main cause of loss of faith among those who had taken vows. So he blames widows for any monks and or nuns who left the faith. He recommended that a woman in a widowed state emulate Naomi or Judith or Tabitha or Saint Anne, because these biblical widows exemplified qualities that real life widows were not expected to have, that they implicitly lacked, which was loyalty, compassion, courage, purity, and maternal dedication. Unmarried women in general were dangerous. They were the loose cannons of the religious world. Widows provoked distrust and anxiety because they were neither virgins nor wives. So they didn't fit into this ideal Christian, Spanish Christian concept of what a good woman was. And they didn't promote ideals of chastity and Christian marriage. So ideally, most clerics at the time preferred a widow to keep widowhood. If you couldn't keep widowhood, then you should get married or join a convent. We really prefer that you join a convent, but ultimately the decision was up to the woman herself. So if she chose not to remarry or enter a convent, she would be expected to be celibate until she died. Now, convent life, which I'm not going to talk about at length, because that is an entire other, semester-long course worth of information. But any woman who was entering a convent had to write out a will before she went in to bequeath away everything before she took vows. So she had to dispose of her entire estate. And if her husband predeceased her, she had to divest herself of his money as well. For a very long time, women who owned goods or men who owned goods could not be clerics or persons religious because religiosity was bound up in poverty. So let's talk about the whole scene of keeping widowhood. So this woman who doesn't want to enter a convent and doesn't want to remarry has to keep widowhood. So it's lifelong chastity. And she's part of a social group called Miserables Personae, or miserable persons. So widows, orphans, invalids, and the poor are all in this category that the church and society consider people who deserve pity. and they were protected by both the church and the state. And you have to remember that 13th century Spain was 13th century Iberia as a whole was a location of a lot of warfare, a lot of, you know, inter-kingdom and extra-kingdom military endeavors. There was all of the conflicts between the Moors and the Christians, and widows were part of a group who were implicitly protected from warfare. The Fuero of Aragon, in fact, designated widows specifically as people who were to be protected from military violence as a religious noble, you know, a pious act. So the economics of widowhood become really fascinating. So marriage in Iberia was, as one academic put it, a society of acquisitions to which both contribute capital and from which each claims varying proportions of profit and debt. So it's very much a business arrangement. Now, a widow comes out of a marriage with property, and the property is determined by law. Her own property is comprised of any endowment, any gifts that were left to her by her husband, her own wedding trousseau, any inheritance from her parents, everything that she alone owned before the marriage, and whatever part of acquired property and debts that the town that she lived in allowed her to have. Now, most of a man's property goes to his children or other heirs, as he designated them, which causes a lot of problems that we'll get into later. So let's look at wills, because wills get fairly complex. In general, the Fuero Real said that anyone who was underage, had amnesia, had no common sense, or who were serfs or had been sentenced to death for a crime, heretics, were not allowed to make a will. And if they did make a will, it wasn't valid. So only people in their right mind who were of legal age and weren't indentured to someone else and weren't felons were allowed to make a valid will. So to the state, the purpose of the will was to keep land and money in the hands of Castilian Catholics, to keep it away from the Muslims, the Jews, the heretics. And then men of religion were prohibited from inheriting anything. Women, however, were not prohibited from making a will or inheriting, which is different to a lot of Europe at the time. There's a whole bunch of little things that make up the concept of inheritance, and we'll go through these. So inheritance law usually involves the partition, the division of an estate. And normally the division of a man's estate takes place as soon as possible after the funeral. And the wife's inheritance and overall economic security was dependent almost entirely on that division. The partition itself could be delayed by the age of their children, the wishes of the husband's heirs, if the heirs weren't in town, etc. So there are all these roadblocks that she has to go through. Now, there were a lot of options actually to postpone the partition of the estate, because say you are a widow whose deceased husband had an heir who is of age and who doesn't like you for whatever reason. Maybe you're his stepmother, you know, maybe you were mean to him as a child. He doesn't like you, and you know that he's going to make a play to prevent you from getting your portion of the estate. There's a bunch of options of how to structure a will so that this can't happen. And the first one is a jointure agreement, which is an agreement between a husband and wife during their marriage that basically says a widow has the right to use the property of the deceased until a set time. So you could have an hermandad, which puts off the partition of an estate until after the widow dies. So she gets use of the entire estate, the house, the land, the livestock, the money, etc., until she dies. And then the heirs gets what's left, what is left. Or you could have a mediatus jointure, which was set up usually in case of no offspring from marriage. So if you did not have children, a husband could transfer full ownership of all his movables, so all of his loose property and his real property, meaning lands and real estate, to the surviving spouse. So if a married couple has no children and the man dies with no heirs, his automatic heirs reverts to his birth family, so to his parents and then to his brothers. So to keep his brothers from basically pushing his widow into poverty, they could set up this arrangement before he died. But it had to be created before he died. It had to be written out and formalized. So you couldn't, your husband can't drop dead and you can say, oh, no, he said I could have everything after he died. That doesn't fly. They don't believe in that. Or you could have a will that makes the wife her husband's unrestricted heir, which basically means that she can have everything. And that form of will wasn't even legal in Castile until the 13th century. Now, there's also a system of bequests where a person can go through in their will and designate certain people to have certain amounts of their property or certain items of property. And the fuero real kept the Visigothic, the Germanic custom of a freely disposable fifth of one's property, which meant that 1/5 of your estate could be given to anyone you wanted to, unrestricted. The church, the state had no say in it. Now, up until the 12th century, that fifth was usually used to buy you out of purgatory, basically. If you died without a will, 1/5 of your stuff could be given to the parish clergy by the town to redeem your soul. Otherwise, anything above that fifth can be allotted to anyone you want, as long as you first provide for your children. So the children of marriages were supremely important in inheritance law. Children would get the first choice of houses if the couple owned more than one, and the surviving spouse was not allowed to take the best house, even if it had been the couple's primary residence. The best, often defined in one section of the Fuero Real as a fine house with upstairs rooms that faces the main road. So they were very specific. Now, in Extremadura, you could bequeath half of your goods to your spouse, where other townships only allowed 1/5. So it really, your economic status, your economic state as a widow is highly dependent on where you happen to live when your husband died. Now, widows were entitled to something called perquisites, and these are basic necessities that the town would set aside from a couple's joint property to make sure that the widow is not out on the streets with nothing, and she was not required to share this with anyone else, not even her children. So usually perquisites included a house, not necessarily furnished, and only if the couple had more than one. So if they only had one house, she wasn't guaranteed to get that one, but she would be given another house of lesser value. She was also given the marriage bed and all of its dressings, a mule, an ass, or a pony, but not a horse. Noble women usually got both a riding mule and a pack mule because you can't be expected to carry your own stuff. She got all of her own clothes, so anything she brought into the marriage with her or bought with her own money. Sometimes she would get all of the clothing that her husband had bought her during the marriage, any of her late husband's gifts to her, and any jewelry that she or her family paid for. And what this did was allowed a widow this sort of financial breathing room as a single woman to hold her over either until she dies or until she remarries. However, if you mess up and you remarry or start planning a wedding before the end of a year's mandatory mourning after your spouse's death, or if you take a lover, all of those perquisites could be taken from her and returned to the husband's family to divide up among the heirs and the rest of the family. So this is basically a listing. Clothing in general was considered conjugal property unless she or her family had purchased it or it was a gift from her husband. So if he bought clothing but didn't expressly say in the will that it was a gift to her, she didn't get to keep it. And the bed was both a symbolic bequest and a really practical financial bequest. So basically, the wife and mother is the center of the family, and the marriage bed represents her central position. And it reminds her constantly of her husband and is supposed to ensure that she remains chaste. Practically speaking, beds were often really elaborately carved. They had feather pillows, feather mattresses, nice sheets, beautiful spreads, hangings. This was worth money. So if she found herself in a hard place, she could sell the entirety of the marriage bed and make a significant amount of money. So here are some examples in different places of what the widow's perquisites would look like. As you can see, Salamanca wasn't a terrible place to be a widow because you got all kinds of things. The bed, the house, tables and benches, chests. You would get a small field and a small vineyard, a pair of oxen, an ass or a mule, milling rights at the local mills. You got everything that you needed to set up your home, all of your cutlery, all of your crocks and trenchers and cups and spoons. So you were set up. It might be the second best house, but it was completely furnished. Now, interestingly enough, I'm going to give a little aside because the clothing issue is really interesting. And in certain kingdoms, exactly what kind of clothing that a woman was allowed to have after her husband died was regulated by law. So, for example, in Navarre, only certain items of clothing and accessories were allowed, and some of them were strictly limited. So a widow in Navarre was allotted 3 togas, so 3 hats, 2 for every day, 1 fancy one for Sunday, and 2 sheepskin cloaks, 1 plain for every day and 1 fancy one for Sunday. Castile allowed widows no more than 3 changes of clothing out of the couple's acquisitions. So anything that they bought together, any clothing that was purchased by them as a couple, she was only allowed to keep 3 changes. Now, we get into the thorny question of children and guardianship. So Spanish law established something called Ascendant Succession, which meant that a widowed mother could claim the property and inheritance of any of her children who died without descendants of their own. So a child had to live 9 days after birth, and then a posthumous child was entitled to paternal inheritance. So the mother would receive support from this. So she was basically the child's regent in all legal affairs. And if she outlived a posthumous child, she was able to claim some of its property. Now, guardianship gets thorny in Spain. It's supposed to protect the children at all costs from everyone during their most vulnerable years. And it was supposed to be their inheritance should outfit them for the adult world. So between 1350 and 1750, more than 80% of noblemen chose their wives to be the guardians of their children. Even though the church and the law both recommended that it be a man, an uncle or a grandfather, most noblemen chose their wives, because Spanish nobility was very concerned with the preservation of family, power, and lineage. And to them, the preservation of their family name was more important than traditional gender roles. They expected and trained their female relatives to take active part in the economic and political affairs of the family. Because if you can imagine, say you're married to an hidalgo, a knight, and he goes off to fight in a skirmish against the Moors and he's killed. Maybe he goes with all of his brothers and they're all killed. somebody has to manage the estate while he's gone, and somebody's going to have to manage the estate when he doesn't come back. Women of the family in general were considered the most competent to take care of both the estate and the children because they were intimately involved with the raising of children and the running of the estate. Why appoint some distant cousin your child's guardian when that guardian wouldn't know anything about them? The mother is infinitely more suited. So there's 3 different types of guardian. The quotes are: when a father appoints a guardian for his children by will, when a grandparent appoints a guardian for his grandchildren. So the idea is that if a man has an adult son who is an idiot and might take all of the children's money, a grandfather can appoint a guardian for his grandchildren that is not the father, and that's in order to protect them from their father's follies. And a mother could appoint a guardian for children who inherit property from her, but only if her children have no father. So that would be any of her offspring, whose father had died, or if she had never married. Now, the Siete Partidas says a person who is appointed a guardian of minors should be neither dumb, deaf, nor destitute of understanding, nor a spendthrift of his property, nor of bad morals. The party should be over 25 years of age and a man, but not a woman. But you can see that practically this didn't really hold true. Women could be appointed guardians of grandchildren or children, and any mother who wanted custody, guardianship of her children should have it, they said, in preference to any of their other relatives, provided that she's a good and prudent woman. So guardianship could not be assumed by anyone. It had to be stated in the will. Now, coming back to the slides and the idea of ascendant succession, what's interesting to note is that ascendant succession rules applied to a domiciled mistress, a baragana, as well as a wife. So if a young man or an older man has a mistress and has children, these succession laws apply to those children and to that woman as if they were married. And when we hit the end, we'll talk about how sometimes it was economically and legally better for a woman to never marry the man that she had children with. So here we go. Apparently I got ahead of myself in the slideshow just a little bit. So I'm going to skip through the things that I mentioned. So, okay. Now, an interesting thing before I get too deep in the weeds of the multiple wife problem, and let me back up a little bit so I'm not distracting you with a new slide. So in general, legally speaking, women overall were expected to waive their right to appear or represent themselves or defend themselves in court. Women were expected to be legally defended by men. But here's the interesting thing. A guardian is expected to be the legal representative of the children for whom they are a guardian. So it creates this interesting paradox where now you have a person who isn't supposed to represent themselves in court, but is supposed to represent themselves in court. So what happens is that this legal fiction arises in which a woman who is a guardian is considered male for legal purposes. She has to leave behind all of these social weaknesses that were usually afforded to women at the time. She is expected to take on a man's role at that point, and the courts considered her male. This let her participate in the entirety of the public realm, including courts of law. She could do business for herself. She could do business on behalf of her children. And these were realms that were normally prohibited to her in her own right. So that's a fascinating little thing that's sort of on my plate to explore a bit later. Now, let's get into the thorny thicket that is remarriage. So, after a husband dies, the widow has an unrestricted right to remarry. She was allowed to choose her own husband, even if her parents were still alive, but she had to observe a year of mourning. If she married too early, everything that she had received in the will could be taken from her and given back to the husband's family, and she could forfeit custody of the children. Now, most of these laws actually applied to men as well, but you have this system where there is actually provisions for divorce in the Siete Partidas. So the thorny issue overall becomes this conjugal property, things that people own together. So if the man dies intestate, the state divides the property up by bed, and a bed is by marriage. So marriages in order of when they happened, and within each marriage to each child by birth order. So it basically go wife 1, child AB, wife 2, child CD, wife 3, child EF, which means as they're dividing things up, the first wife and her children, no matter how long ago he was married, receive the biggest share of the estate, while the last wife and her children receive the least. And I have a little graphic for this. So say a man had 3 wives, he dies. The first thing that happens is that the courts split the estate 50%, and that 50% goes to wife A. And either upon her death or as she passes it on, the 3 children that she has splits everything that belongs to their mother and half of what that couple acquired during their marriage. Wife B gets half of the original half of the estate. And then her children split that half that it was left over by birth order. And then poor wife C gets half of what was left of the half of the half. And her children split that by birth order. And then that last 25% goes back to wife A. So wife A gets her half plus another quarter in all cases. And in the realm of remarriage, because mistresses were treated as wives for purposes of inheritance and nothing else, it would very frequently behoove a woman to not marry a man. If she didn't marry him before she had children, she could still get married. She would still get marital property, but she didn't have to wait that year of mourning before remarrying. So her previous lover could die and she could immediately marry another man. In a lot of ways, it becomes a little more convenient for her at that point. So that is the bulk of my presentation. Does anybody have questions? I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. There we go.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Questions.
Yes. They recognize divorce.
Okay. So starting at the top from the beginning of the slides, were there similar perceptions of widowers as lazy and unproductive? No, absolutely not. Men were never really considered as deeply untrustworthy as widows were, unless they proved that they were, basically. You know, if he gambled away all of his family's money, or he beat his wife, or he neglected his children, or he was an idiot, he was basically considered an idiot. And, you know, anything that he might be able to get his hands on that would cause any sort of injury to his children would be taken out of his control.
but it really didn't, it didn't religiously affect his character the way it did for widows.
And then how do those perceptions of widows compare to the perceptions outside of Spain and the Iberian Peninsula?
I think it depends on what country that you're in, but Isidore of Seville's writings, his religious writings influenced a large amount of Christian theology in the Middle Ages during the medieval era. And if you start digging into a lot of cleric work, you start digging into the medieval philosophers, and you start to notice that they have a dim view of women and a dimmer view of anyone who might not be chaste enough to their standards. So.
And then a clarifying question on what was the age of majority that applied to all of these?
I didn't say, because it varies by kingdom, and it varies by time period. And in Castile, through I'd say through to the end of the Reconquista, at least, it seems to travel back and forth between 14 and 16. So.
Okay. So we might have clarified this question a little bit later in the slides from when it was asked, but just to cover our bases, when the widow who has inherited property dies, it goes to her kids in the order of birth?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. Wives in order of marriage, children in order of birth.
Excellent.
Oh, and Juana, if there is one of those jointure agreements, when the widow dies, either her children receive all the stuff, or mediatus is the childless. It would revert back to his family. Basically, she is not really the executor, but like the estate representative. So she can use some of the materials that are part of the estate, but she can't keep it forever. It's considered a very long-term loan.
And then next up was, who is making these wills? Is it estate lawyers or?
Again, it depends on the kingdom. They would make wills with lawyers. Sometimes it was enough to write out a will and have a cleric witness who's signing it. Sometimes it was enough. In some kingdoms, I want to say in Galicia, it was legal for a husband and wife to sit down and write out a will, as long as it was written down.
And then the last question that you haven't already addressed, or I think we did cover this a little bit, but for men who have both a recognized mistress and a wife, it's wife first, then mistress?
No, it would be whatever order they had come in.
Okay.
So if he had a mistress and then got married, in Castile, it would be legal wife and then mistress. But in Valencia, for a long time, it was mistress and then legal wife, because the mistress, if she had children especially, those children came first.
And then next we have, if a widow had enough money to buy clothing on her own, would she legally be allowed to?
Yep. She was largely unrestricted on what she was allowed to do with money that she directly inherited. It's only when children get involved that they get a lot more stringent about what you're allowed to do with your money, because you can't outfit yourself in fine clothing and leave the children to go hungry and cold. So once again, we have to worry about the people that will carry on the family lineage.
Were there any other restrictions that applied to living as a widow?
Well, I mean, they had to be chaste, which is which for some women was very troublesome. There are a lot of accounts of women that just didn't find that particularly interesting. But the interesting thing was, at least for widows who were legal guardians of children, they were basically they had all the rights of men at that point. So they, I mean, women could work. It was not unusual for women to work in Spain. I mean, they weren't terribly restricted. So that was really interesting. Businesses or guild memberships. I haven't looked into the guild memberships yet, but businesses, yes, that would be part of the estate. Is very frequently the vineyards. Sometimes those vineyards were used for private consumption, but just as frequently they were basically, making wine to sell. So yes, she would absolutely be allowed to run, especially if it was a home-based business. So Juana, a lot of times the advantage to a woman's family to marry the daughter off. So once your daughter is married, you no longer have to provide an inheritance for her unless you want to legally at this point. So one thing would be to reduce the number of your own family members who you would split your inheritance amongst. And yeah, Isabel Maria, very frequently abandoned women could be considered widows. Again, it seems to depend on the town and the kingdom, and especially the time. In periods of intense warfare, you find a lot more frequency of women who were abandoned being considered in that category of miserables personae, of people to pity. Apply to children of unconsenting encounters. Guys, I haven't looked into that yet. Actually, there is a section on the Siete Partidas about that. I haven't gotten that far in my translating yet. So I will let you know. The impression that I got from a quick skim is that in several of the Iberian kingdoms, if it was an unconsenting encounter, the man was still responsible for the children. But you also have to bear in mind that the medieval church could have very strange to us ideas of consent and non-consent. And in many places and times, there was no such thing as unconsenting. Illicit daughters would inherit part of the estate as well. So it was split among the children, not just among the boys. Yeah. Now, another tidbit from further on in history, when you get up into the 16th century, there's an interesting phenomena with inheritance under Isabella and Ferdinand. During the conquest of the New World, you have conquistadors who go into the New World and take over territory. And Isabella I was convinced that men conquered women civilized. So she heard these stories of basically conquistador males running rampant in these new lands of hers. So she set up a scheme to convince hidalgos, which are the daughters of the knightly class, who were often nearly impoverished because of the great economic disparity between the nobility and everyone else. She would recruit these women to go to the New World and marry conquistadors to civilize things. And part of the bribe to go over there is that if you agreed to go to Peru and marry a conquistador and basically stay there forever, Isabella would eliminate every single other person from your father's line of inheritance so that that woman would inherit everything. And then she would do the same for the conquistador's line of inheritance. So if he died, the wife got everything. And there is at least one story of a woman in Peru who arrives in Peru with this batch of young women, and the conquistadors have this sort of, the men of the little settlement have this sort of welcome party for them. And, I like to imagine it as like the 8th grade dance, got all the men on one side kind of sizing up the women, and all the women on the other sizing up the men. And the women are, the story is written down. This is a story by one of the women in the group. The women are talking amongst themselves. Oh, that man looks nice. I'd like to marry him. That man has a nice laugh. He's handsome. I want to marry him. And one woman in the group steps out in front of all the other women and points at the men and says, which one is the oldest? I want to marry him. And she did. And he died within 3 years. So she got all of his money. And then she married another elderly man, and he died within 5 years. And she got all of his money, and eventually became one of the wealthiest women in South America just by marrying these old men and waiting for them to die. That story is in a book called Daughters of the Conquistadors, which is a really fascinating look at these women of the knightly class who volunteered to civilize the New World. Oh yeah, I've seen that. I've also heard about women who had heard that like their men had died exploring the New World and then married someone else, and then their husband rolls back up again. Yeah, it always causes problem.
We're at about the 5-minute mark, and Portia is interested in recommended readings for more information on this.
I would definitely read that Daughters of the Conquistadors. I'm trying to remember. I think my handout may have sources in it. My other computer just kicked off. If not, I would be happy to send people stuff. I used a lot of academic paperwork, articles that I retrieved from JSTOR. A young man at one point wrote an entire doctoral dissertation on women in the Siete Partidas, in which he frequently expressed surprise that women were treated differently than men in the Middle Ages. So that can be fairly amusing to read, because he just, bless his heart, sounds genuinely surprised that there were different treatments of people. So, it makes for some delightful reading. Like, oh, bless, he's upset about this. So yeah, I'd be happy if any of y'all want to get in contact with me. I am more than happy. My website is www.SpanishSeamstress.com. Oops, and I just sent that directly to Marion, which is super useful instead of to everybody else, because it's not like Marion is my apprentice and knows this already. That's got all my contact information. It also has all of my handouts and slide decks from all the classes that I teach. You may send me an email through that, or you may email me at beatrizaluares@gmail.com.
And I did put the handout and slide deck back in the chat again, in case anybody needs it one more time. And I believe that information is already in there as well.
Yep. And both of those are in PDF form, and the slide deck PDF has been compressed, so it won't eat a whole bunch of space. So. Okay, we have about 7 minutes. Does anybody else have any questions? Thank you. Glad you enjoyed it.
It's Beatriz.Aluares?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you.
If there are no more questions, I think I'm going to stop the recording.